Milner, that is. And I'm just going to have a chat with you about what I'm doing at Latinum at the moment. So I'm working on it every day. And the area that I'm working on is at latinum.substack.com. And at latinum.substack.com, you will find something quite interesting, which is a series of reading courses designed in a very particular way. The common way that languages were taught in the pre-modern era was often with a special kind of text called a construed text. And these are found in manuscript going back, the earliest ones, certainly in the form that I'm using 3,000 years ago. And there are other formats that were used by the ancient Sumerians and the Akkadians and in Ugarit, with two languages, one language glossed with the other language. And this is how students learned. They learned one language through the medium of the other language, with both languages present on the page at the same time. So no slogging around with a dictionary. And there's another thing that there's a lot of academic research on called extensive reading. There are two ways to approach language learning. One is through the drilling approach that you find on Duolingo, for example, where you are tested constantly and recall is tested constantly. But the problem with that is that you're limited to a very, very small vocabulary because of Zipf's law. Zipf's law is a mathematical law about the structure of languages, and it applies across all languages. And it's very disconcerting once you realize what it is. The most common word in a language is twice as common as the next word. And that word is twice as common as the next word. So as you go on through the vocabulary in order of frequency, the words become less and less frequent. And finally, when you get to the very infrequent words, which happens very quickly, after you've reached past 500, 600 words, the words are not occurring that often, and they get very infrequent. So the problem facing someone learning a language is that you're going to hit a word, and you might only hit it once, or maybe twice. So you're going to see that word, you're going to have to run to the dictionary, look it up. It's very time consuming. Or what most language courses do is they try to reduce the number of words that students are taught at the beginning. Then you end up with very boring sentences or very absurd sentences. And this then requires a lot of willpower from the student because the subject matter is extremely irritating, boring, it's not normal. So what the intralinear, the construed text that I'm using does is it frees me up from this. So each lesson does focus on one word, that's true. And the courses in each language, and there are over 30 languages now, maybe they're over 40, I can't remember. And each lesson focuses on one word, and the courses are structured by frequency. So the first lesson in every language is the, or the equivalent of the in that language, or if that language doesn't have the, then explaining why it doesn't have the and how the English concept of the is rendered in that language and understood by the speakers of that language. Because when we are learning a foreign language, we relate to it in terms of our own language. So if you're an English speaker, it's natural to think of English word frequency as the thing that we look at, not the frequency in the language that we're studying. And then we work out how to translate, how to render the English concepts into that other language. For the first 50, 60 words, there's a great overlap anyway between the frequencies in all languages, because the concepts that are spoken about are consistent across languages pretty much. So one second, I've got a great big sun shining there. Let's move the camera a little bit. So what I'm doing is I've constructed a system that uses the intralinear, but the intralinear has got some problems, and this is why it's not used in the classroom anymore, because it's regarded as something slightly impure. Because to make an intralinear, you have to either do violence to one language or the other, because you are mixing both languages together to make a comprehensible learning experience where you can read the two languages together. So a construed text isn't an interlinear where one line's above the other. They are constant in a stream. So you have the word and then it's followed by its translation. And if it's in an alphabet that we're not familiar with, and not in the Latin alphabet, then there's a transliteration as well. So if, for example, we're doing Ugaritic, which is in cuneiform, an alphabetic form of cuneiform, then there will be a transliteration. But in the second iteration of the lesson, then it will also be transliterated. In the third, just in the cuneiform. Or if it's going to be, for example, Hindi, which I'm working on at the moment. So the part A will be English and Hindi with the Hindi typescript, the transliteration, the translation. And then in part B, we have full sentences, the full Hindi sentence in its natural order and the full English sentence next to it in its natural order. But before you get to that, you have to look at the construed text above to give you all the vocabulary. And then in part C, we just have the Hindi with no English. So it's a kind of way of testing yourself without a test. If you can read part C, then you've succeeded. If you can't, you have to go back to part B. If you're still struggling with part B and having to skip your eye across the translation, then you go back to part A. And you keep going backwards and forwards until you can read part C fluently. And then below that, there's a grammar section in some detail about the focus word for the lesson, and a cultural section that talks about why and how this word is used. And then after that, so that's the first lesson, then we do a piece of literature, very short, because we are aiming at beginners, and so we don't want to overwhelm them with a large amount of high-level text. But I think it's important to actually experience the real language as it's used in literature, especially as it's a reading course, right from the beginning. And then you pick up more vocabulary, more forms. This is treated the same way, A, B, C, D. And then following that, the lesson goes through a third section, which is called the genre section. And here we select something, for example, a love story, and we make up a love story that focuses and revolves around the key word of the lesson. But vocabulary ranges very freely. There's no restriction because we have the construed text, which allows me to use any words I like. So I can make a more interesting experience for you when you're learning. Then we go to part B, part C, part D. And at the end, there's every lesson, there's a little bit of stuff about the course and how it works and so on and so forth, and some links. So every course is structured in this way. It's a reading course, so there's no audio. If you want audio, if you're learning a modern language, I suggest then you just go online and find an internet radio station in that language, where it's talk radio, and just play it in the background while you're doing other things, while you're washing the dishes, while you're doing things that don't require your attention. Because you will start to pick up how the language sounds, and as you start to use the course and start to learn vocabulary and start to learn patterns, you'll start to recognize them in the spoken speech that you're hearing. And then eventually you will be able to understand the spoken language without actually actively engaging with it in your formal study. That's pretty much how I learned to speak French. I learned French at school through reading texts. There was almost no speaking. There was a little bit of listening. We had a language lab kind of experience where headphones were put on and you sat in a little cubicle. But this was a very small part of the course. The course was almost exclusively a reading course. There was no emphasis on how we actually pronounced the French at all. No one was checking whether we said things properly. It didn't matter. As long as we could read it, translate it, and write in it to some degree, that's all that mattered. And then I now do speak French, but I achieved that primarily by listening to the radio, Radio France Internationale back then with shortwave radio, because there was no internet. And I had the shortwave radio on and just had it playing in my room at nighttime. And eventually, I picked up French. And it's quite exciting when you do that, actually, because you're reading, you're studying with reading, and then you're starting to learn words, but you don't know you know them. And then suddenly you hear them in the context and think, your brain has switched it on, because your brain's doing all this work all by itself. You don't need to actively be testing yourself. It's true that if you're in a school situation, and the teacher needs marks to put on on a sheet of paper to grade you for a course, then you have to be tested. But if you're studying by yourself, this is totally irrelevant. You don't need testing. you can get a very good idea from my courses of how you're progressing, about it, where you can read the part C of each section without having to go back to part A and part B. And if you can read part C and you can understand it, then you have succeeded and you don't need any test and you don't need any numbers. So that's how the course works. And recently I've done a Georgian course. I'm now working on the Hindi for English speakers. There's already a Hindi course, but it's for English for Hindi speakers, so it's the other way around. It can still be used to some degree in part B and part C, but it doesn't have the grammar sections and doesn't have a good construed text for learning Hindi, because it's not really made for that. There's an Aramaic course I've worked on recently, and more quixotically, a Ugaritic course. Ugaritic is a Semitic language from the Bronze Age that is very close to biblical Hebrew, but it's in a Canaanite religious context. So it's very interesting because it gives you when you study this language, you get exposed to the texts and you get a little window into that world, the biblical world, as it actually was, but from a completely different perspective, from a living city. We have the texts from the Royal Library and from several other locations throughout the city. They wrote on cuneiform tablets, so we have a lot of information about the temples, about literature. There are literary works about Baal and so on, and it's all very interesting. So that course is being made. I've actually made about 40-something lessons. I want to remake the first few because I changed the orthography halfway through because I found a better resource, and so I'm going to go back and rejig the first few lessons. But the course is usable as it is, although I think the lessons towards the end are better quality than the lessons towards the beginning. But that was interesting, because to make a course like that with a dead language that is for me quite exciting. And when I finished it, and I have the systems able to deal with this language effectively, then I want to create some other resources, like some stories, perhaps some conversational material for Ugaritic, which will be even more quixotic, because no one has spoken this language since the Trojan War, basically. Ugarit ceased to exist around the time of the Trojan War. So that's the sort of time period we're talking of, ancient Egypt type of thing. I'm also thinking of Sumerian and Akkadian, but these present particular problems because of the complications of the cuneiform script. So I haven't decided yet whether to make these courses in transliteration only or with the cuneiform as well. Ugaritic's easy because the cuneiform of Ugaritic is alphabetical, and so it doesn't really present any massive problems. But when you talk about Sumerian or Akkadian, we're talking about 600 different cuneiform symbols, and that's a lot, even more. Even most student texts try to limit that to 300-400, but that's still a lot of symbols. So I haven't decided yet what to do. Anyway, you can find all that at latinum.substack.com, or you can go to latinum.org.uk, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to sign off for now. It is, almost 2 o'clock in the afternoon here. Goodbye for now.